If you were here last Sunday, you may recall that I mentioned 5 pillars, 5 core values, but we'll call them pillars here at Westminster, that I believe are part of this congregation's DNA and are essential to the vision that I have and that our staff has for the life of our church together. What are those 5 pillars? I won't give you a quiz right now, don't worry. They are hospitality, generosity, justice, imagination, and joy. And so this Sunday, we begin our fall sermon series on the parables of Jesus. Why the parables of Jesus? The first reason is that I believe the parables are good examples of those 5 pillars. Not every parable is about each one, but many of the parables touch on at least one of those, if not more of those 5 words. The second reason that we're doing a sermon series on the parables this fall is that I believe Jesus told the parables to shape our imaginations about God. They are meant to tease us, to provoke us, to kindle within us new ways of considering who God is and to have a new imagination for what the kingdom of God might be like. Our parable for today certainly fits that mold. It may be the most familiar story that Jesus ever told. Listen now to our gospel reading for today, coming from Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our sermon series this fall is entitled Once Upon a Time, which may call to mind perhaps fairy tales. Now, I do not think the parables of Jesus should be categorized as fairy tales, but there is a fascinating connection. I learned something on a recent podcast about the history of fairy tales. Malcolm Gladwell interviewed an individual named Angus Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher is an award-winning teacher and author, and Dr. Fletcher describes how there are basically two types of fairy tales that have been written throughout history. One type is the kind that Disney has adopted. Fletcher calls this the poetic justice fairy tale. It's when the hero of the story, who is good, receives good in the end. Think of Walt Disney's classic Cinderella, in which Cinderella, despite her evil stepmother and stepsisters, shows that the glass slipper fits and marries the handsome prince. The other type of fairy tale, according to Fletcher, is of an earlier kind. Back in the 16th century, an Italian writer named Giovanni Straparola wrote a 2-volume collection containing 75 stories. In Straparola's fairy tales, good does not necessarily happen to good people. Good happens to fools or to people who are unkind or selfish. Dr. Fletcher calls these fairy tale twist stories. One example is the story of Adam and Tina. Adam and Tina's family is starving, and she is sent by the family to buy food at the market. She goes with the family's last coin. But instead of buying food, Adam and Tina makes a whimsical purchase of a doll. She takes the doll home, and her older sister is distraught. It's the end of the family. They're going to starve. Only the doll turns out to be a magic doll, which spits out money for the family for food. In other words, Adam and Tina does not deserve what she has received. She's not virtuous. She's not thoughtful. And yet good comes to someone who did something not so good. What's fascinating is that Dr. Fletcher did some research and found out that children over time gave a more positive response to fairy tale twist stories. Now, I don't think Jesus had fairy tale twist stories in mind when he told today's parable, but if I can mix fairy tale genres here, the shoe fits. Good does not come from good in today's parable, right? There is no poetic justice for the younger brother. What is there? There's a party. And it's the party in this story that turns everyone's world upside down. Why is that? You know why. It was the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia who remarked in a lecture at Harvard years ago, "Parents know that children will accept quite readily all sorts of arbitrary rules. No television in the afternoon, or no television in the evening, or even no television at all. But," Scalia went on to say, "try to let one brother or sister watch television when the others do not, and you will feel the fury of the fundamental sense of justice unleashed." I think it's safe to say that the older brother in our story knows that fury. The parable of the prodigal son is often described as a parable about forgiveness, as a parable about lost and found, and it is, but you know what else it's about? It's about justice. What happens when good falls in the lap of someone who did not deserve it? Or, at the very least, the good that someone else receives is what you think you really should have received instead. Years ago, when I was working with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps in my first year out of college, I was a paralegal with a poverty law agency in Hartford, Connecticut. It was a volunteer position. We got paid a little bit more than $400 a month. And because I lived with a handful of other volunteers with JVC, we pooled our paychecks together to pay for rent, to pay for food, to pay for utilities, and that was about it. I remember at one point, about 10 or 11 months into my volunteer year, some law school interns were hired and brought into the law office at which I was working. They were going to be there just for the summer, 3 of them, if memory serves. Well, one day that summer, the director of the law office was standing outside my office, only he was talking with the 3 summer interns. My door was open, and I overheard him telling the summer interns that the Hartford newspaper was doing a story on people who gave their time for a worthy cause. In other words, people who were basically volunteering, and he had shared their names with the paper so that they could get a picture and a story and a write-up. What do you think I did when I heard that in my office? My mouth hit the floor. They were there for the summer. I'd been working with them for the entire year. How could he reward them with a story in the paper instead of me? In case you haven't guessed, I'm an older brother, and I get where the older brother's coming from. For all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. Do you see what he's saying to his dad? This party that you're throwing, it's not right, it's not fair, it's not just. So, if God behaves the way the father in this story behaves, then this story, number 1, invites us to consider what the justice of God ultimately looks like. But you know what else it asks us to do? Do you recall the father's response to his oldest son? Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice. We had to celebrate. In other words, this is a parable that not only says something about what the justice of God may look like, but also something about what the joy of God looks like. We had to celebrate and rejoice. Getting back to that summer after college when I was a volunteer, what's interesting to me now, almost 30 years later, is how I viewed that time in my life back then. I saw myself as a hard worker. I saw that year as a way of essentially giving my time and my energy and my abilities in service to people in poverty and for a greater good. And I suppose, in a way, it was all those things. But all these years later, what I've come to see much more clearly now is not what I gave, but what I received. It was the year that I decided to go to seminary, not because it was my idea, but because another pastor planted that seed in me and then basically pushed me to go. If it wasn't for that year, I may not be standing here before you today. It was a year in which I learned by working with people who spent every day in poverty what it truly meant to live in poverty. And I saw firsthand what it meant to be sick. Most of my clients were people with HIV and AIDS. In the days before, there was the kind of treatment that there is today. I represented them in their hearings for Social Security disability benefits, and in a way that I had never seen so close up, I came to learn just how fragile and precious human life really is. And so I also saw, in a very tangible way, how life itself is a gift. You see, in hindsight, it was a year in which I received much more than I gave. I was blessed by many gifts, by the people with whom I worked and for whom I worked, and I didn't notice. everything that I was receiving at the time that I was receiving it. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever missed the gifts you were receiving at the time you were receiving them? Because of the noise of the world or the noise in your head, it just kind of drowned out your ability to hear and see and experience the gifts that God was giving you. Let me get at it like this. I read a story a few years ago about the composer George Gershwin. Once, while on a train from New York to Boston, Gershwin was inspired to compose the major portion of Rhapsody in Blue. It was on that train, of all places, with its steely rhythms and its click-clack regularity of sound, the bells and whistles and all the other distractions, that Gershwin was inspired and suddenly heard the complete construction of the Rhapsody from beginning to end. Much later, Gershwin made this remark: "I frequently hear music in the very heart of noise." I frequently hear music in the very heart of noise. Not a bad way to think about this parable, because there's a lot of noise going on in that older brother's head. I didn't get this. How could he get that? It's all about deserve, deserve, deserve. Are there any other older siblings in this congregation here today? What's the noise that's going on in your heads right now? Is it the compulsive feeling to accomplish this, do that, never get off the cycle of moving up the ladder of life? Is it the voice that tells you to worry about this, worry about that? If you didn't spend so much time worrying, you wouldn't know what to do. Or maybe there's that older brother noise of the grudge that you hold, the wound that you nurse, and there's a bitterness that's forming in your heart. This is a parable about justice, and it's a parable about joy, and it feels to me like they are on a collision course in this story. I've shared this with you once before. It's sort of a modern-day parable about justice and joy. The retired professor of preaching, Tom Long, describes a brush with the law that he had a few years ago. Pulling out of a gas station, he had to cross 4 lanes of traffic to get into the left turn lane. But before he could complete the maneuver, traffic stopped, and his car was stuck in between the 2 lanes, the nose of the car in one, the tail of the car in another. To his astonishment, Tom Long then saw police lights in the rear view mirror. The policeman got out, wrote a ticket, and said, "You are impeding the flow of traffic. You have violated section 62.130 of the state code." "What in the world is that?" Long asked. "Look it up in the library," the officer replied. And so he did. Long says he went to the library, read the code in question, and came to the conclusion that he had in fact not impeded the flow of traffic. So he challenged the ticket. A court date was set. Tom Long got on the internet, he did more research, and he entered the courtroom on the appropriate date with a file folder that was 2 inches thick to prove that he had not impeded the flow of traffic. When the time came, the judge called him to the bench. "The officer who wrote your ticket is no longer employed by the county," said the judge. "There is no one here to bear witness against you. You are free to go." And Tom Long said he did not jump for joy. Why? Because something inside him wanted to reply, "Wait! You can't dismiss my case like this. I have a file folder 2 inches thick that says I'm innocent." And that may have been true. He may not have broken the law. But at that moment, when the judge simply let him go, Long says he had something of a revelation. What he saw very clearly was that there was something inside of him that would rather win the fight than be blessed by grace. Have you ever had that feeling before? Wanting to win the fight instead of being blessed by grace? If you recognize that instinct, it belongs to the older brother, the one who's outside right now, looking like this, stewing about that party. But I don't think Jesus really cares about that imaginary older brother. I think he cares about you and me. Jesus told us a story this morning, a parable about justice and joy. And when it comes to God's justice, I have no idea, quite frankly, how it's all going to work in the end. And I'm so grateful that God's justice depends not on my imagination, but on God's. Do you remember what Julia read from Isaiah? Your ways are not my ways, says the Lord, and your thoughts are not my thoughts. I think this parable reminds us that when it comes to somebody getting something perhaps better than they deserve, that person just might end up being you and me. And when it comes to God's joy, Jesus is very clear. God's joy is found in throwing parties for the prodigal, found in broken families reunited. God's joy is found in giving God's children, both younger brothers and older brothers and everyone in between, so much more than we deserve. The question that's hard to answer is not what brings God joy. It's what you and I are going to do. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. The next time you and I hear the music that beckons us to reconciliation and to new life, will we stay in the field, arms crossed, arguing with God, listening to whatever noise is inside our head? Or will we let ourselves be blessed by grace and start walking toward the music?